So now I'll explain the Nelson model for assessing prospects for a country to experience a balance of payments crisis, often followed by a currency devaluation. Now, I'm in a way sort of joking when I call it the Nelson model, but I think it's a nice, easy way to remember that, and it has a nice ring to it, I would think, the Nelson model. But I shouldn't really call it the Nelson model because this is a model that it's not just something that I use, it's something that the IMF looks at, that any international investors, that big international bankers, that anyone interested in exporting a product to a country, I would advise you, I would think that this would be something very useful to use. And so I have compiled a list of indicators that will predict whether a country is ready to have one of these balance of payments crises, and often followed by a currency devaluation. I think that's a very useful kind of tool to have this collection of indicators. I've just listed the first one here, but there are many more that we will go over. And together they compose what I am, jokingly calling the Nelson model. But I do think that this is a very useful thing. And so what I would actually do when we're done going over these factors, I would actually print out this framework, this list of factors, and I would laminate it, and I would put it in my pocket, and I would be prepared at any moment. You never know when you might want to pull it out and say, oh my gosh, the country where I'm doing business is ready to have a massive balance of payments crisis, which could be followed by a big currency devaluation. That's very useful to know. Thank you, Professor Nelson. Thank you for helping me predict these things. So this is something that I have learned from my own painful personal experiences in Brazil, where I was selling a very expensive product priced in dollars, and suddenly Brazil had a massive currency devaluation, which I didn't see coming. Not many people saw coming, but in retrospect, with this model, this framework, it would have been very easy to predict it. So let's go over how this model works and what essentially is involved here. If we go back and look at the balance of payments, basically we can determine that when a country has a large current account deficit, it's got to balance that out with a correspondingly large capital account surplus if it doesn't want to have its currency devalue, if it doesn't want to have a balance of payments crisis. Well, what determines how large a current account deficit is? What makes... Well, that would be one that is hard to balance out with a capital account surplus. Now, what governments often do is when they have a current account deficit, what they will do is they will find a way to bring in a capital account surplus. That means a surplus of investment capital coming into the country. And that could be foreign direct investment. That could be convincing foreign investors to come in and put a factory or to buy land or put up a hotel. That's stable, very good foreign direct investment. It's more likely to stay. But more often what happens is governments will convince foreign investors to buy government bonds. And that's what we call portfolio capital investment in stocks and bonds. That's much more volatile, right? Because you see that investors can sell those bonds quickly. They can sell their stocks and pull their money out quickly. And that much more liquid investments, easier to sell them. And so, nevertheless, governments, if they want to bring in a capital account surplus in a hurry, it's sometimes difficult to bring in foreign direct investment. That takes years of convincing foreign investors to buy the land or factory or whatever. So governments sometimes will just sell government bonds. And that influx of foreign cash brings in a capital account surplus that can balance out the current account deficit. And so that's how they keep their exchange rates stable. Now, some governments, in retrospect, many economists would say make a mistake, and they try to intentionally, artificially peg their currency to some other country's strong, stable currency. Now, it used to be that every country did this after World War II. That lasted for some time. But now that we've moved to a flexible exchange rate system since 1970s, the IMF actually says that they would prefer that countries keep their currencies stable, that allow their currency the value of their currency to rise and fall based with market forces. If the country is very successful exporting its products, it'll bring in a lot of export revenues, and that will result in a current account surplus, and that will actually increase the value of the country's currency, and that then will make it harder for them to export in the future. So the IMF would prefer to see the country's exchange rate be determined by market forces. That keeps them from always it always reflects the true value of the country's economy, of the country's products. The true competitiveness of their product is reflected in the rise and fall of the flexible exchange rate. But sometimes countries trying to keep their currency stable will artificially peg their currency to some other country's currency. And often they will choose the US dollar. Now, the reason many economists don't think this is a good idea in most cases is that then what happens is your currency is pegged to some other country's currency. It reflects what's happening in that country, not in your own country. So you could have a situation where you peg your currency to the US dollar, and if the US dollar rises, let's say there's lots of investment coming in the United States, people are very excited, the stock market is rising, the US dollar gets stronger, then your currency will get stronger too. And it'll be much more difficult for you to export your products. Your currency will no longer reflect the true competitiveness, the true value of your own product. It reflects what's going on in the United States. And so that means that your currency will be overvalued. And it'll be really difficult at this very strong currency rate to export your products to countries that have weaker currencies. And that means you're going to have a bigger and bigger current account deficit. And to compensate for that, you're going to need to bring in a big capital account surplus. And what governments often do to compensate in that way, they'll sell lots of government bonds. But keep in mind, these government bonds have to be repaid with interest in the future. So that means the government's foreign debt is getting bigger and bigger. And eventually, if you do that long enough, foreign investors start to get nervous. And they say, do we want to keep buying this government bonds? I mean, what if they default? What if they can't pay back? So investors, if they get nervous, might decide to sell the government bonds. And when that happens, they'll get lots of local currency in exchange. They'll take that local currency and exchange it into US dollars or euros, take their money home, and there's a flood of local currencies on the market. That could result in a devaluation. So that's why governments have to be very careful about all this, right? Now, what some governments do is what all governments do is they keep a reserve in their central bank just for this kind of situation. And so what governments will do is they'll often keep US dollars in reserve in their central banks. And the reason they do that is US dollars are readily bought and sold all over the world. And so they keep this reserve of US dollars. And if suddenly investors get nervous and sell lots of assets, get lots of local currency, and then exchange that local currency for dollars, there's a flood of local currency. The country could have a massive devaluation. The central bank of that country will take its dollar reserves and literally buy up the excess local currency, take it out of circulation, and that keeps the supply and demand of currency stable. That keeps the value of the currency stable, and the country doesn't have a massive devaluation. But to do that, the country has to maintain a big surplus in the central bank. And usually, as I say, they keep US dollars. That's why the US dollar, by the way, is known as the reserve currency of the world, because it is so readily accepted in any situation. So these are some things that countries can do to kind of maintain stability in their exchange rates. So this model that I have mentioned is really just designed to help us predict if a country is ready to have a crisis like this or not. And so the factors to look at is the country's exchange rate fixed or flexible? And as I mentioned, a country that has decided to fix its exchange rate, a better term would have been peg its exchange rate to the US dollar. Well, in that kind of situation, remember, the country's currency could get stronger and it doesn't reflect what's going on in that country's economy. That country could have a massive current account deficit. So nowadays, everyone that looks at these things, if they look at a country's exchange rate, they'd like to say, is it pegged to some other country's dollar? Is it currency? Is it fixed, or is it flexible? Does it adjust with market forces? Does it rise and fall if that country gets a lot of exports, revenues flowing in? The currency would get stronger. If it has trouble exporting, the currency will get weaker, and that'll help the country export. This will help the country maintain a stable balance of payments. This will help the country's currency remain stable. The IMF strongly prefers that, if at all possible now that everybody is on this system of flexible exchange rates, that countries let their currency be determined by market forces. Let them rise and fall based on how much money is flowing in or flowing out of that country's economy. And so that is very much something the IMF would like to see. So that's the first thing to notice, right? The second factor to notice is the size of the current account deficit. Now, if that is large, right, as I mentioned before, if the country has a large current account deficit, then that is going to mean that the country, is potentially more vulnerable to this kind of balance of payments crisis. They're going to need to bring in lots of capital, foreign investment capital, to have a big capital account surplus to balance out a large current account deficit. So I think that's another factor to notice, right? And so what we're seeing here, if you notice this, what we're seeing is that we're developing a model here that if the current account deficit is large, the country is more inclined, more likely to have a balance of payments crisis followed by a big currency devaluation than if it's small. Now, what determines large? How do we decide that a country's current account deficit is large? Well, we could look at it as a percentage of that country's gross domestic product, the size of its economy, the size of goods and services that are bought and sold in that country's economy in every given year. And so most economists say if the current account deficit is about under 5% of GDP, then that is a reasonable size current account deficit. You can bring in a capital account surplus big enough to balance out a current account deficit that size. But if it starts to get above that, then you're going to have to sell lots of government bonds. You have to go into deep foreign debt that you could end up not being able to pay back. And so that's where it gets risky. So anything above a 5% of GDP current account deficit, anything above that size is risky, okay? So that was what we would say is a large current account deficit. If it's under that, that's perfectly fine. What would be another factor? Well, keep this in mind. Governments not only have current account deficits, but sometimes they have budget deficits. And budget deficit is a completely different kind of deficit. That's an internal deficit where the government is spending more money than it takes in tax revenues. And if a government has a budget deficit bigger than 5% of GDP, oh my gosh, that government, keep in mind, how is it financing that deficit? Well, usually governments finance these deficits by selling government bonds. And so now the foreign debt is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is why a budget deficit under 5% of GDP is considered okay. But if it's bigger than that, then it's risky. That country now, the foreign debt is getting bigger and bigger. It may default. It may have a balance of payments crisis. And so that's why that's another indicator, right? So it's very interesting. We can see if we go down this list, the factors that would determine if a country is very safe, unlikely ever to have a balance of payments crisis, its currency is going to remain stable, or if a country is very risky, it's much more likely to have a massive currency devaluation. And so clearly we talked about foreign reserves, the important role of the central bank having foreign reserves and sitting there ready to go, ready to buy up excess local currency that is being released onto the markets if investors sell their assets and take their money out of the country. So how do we decide the amount of the foreign reserves? Well, again, it's proportional to the size of the country's economy. But if they have a very small amount of foreign reserves, they're more vulnerable to this kind of crisis. Amount of foreign debt. And again, economists disagree on what is a large foreign debt, and it depends on circumstances. But I can tell you this, if it's getting above 80% of GDP, if you measure it as a percentage of that country's gross domestic product, and the foreign debt is getting to be 80%, equivalent to 80% of that country's GDP, that's getting to be a large foreign debt. If it's above 100% of that country's GDP, that's considered a very large foreign debt. So we see a lot of countries that have these huge foreign debts, and they are very vulnerable to this kind of investors, might say, we're not going to buy government bonds. We're not going to create a capital account surplus by buying your government bonds. The foreign debt is just too big, and we are no longer going to buy foreign government bonds from you. We're actually going to sell our government bonds. So that could actually cause a crisis right there. So as we go down this list, you see the factors that could cause this kind of balance of payments crisis. It could cause investors to pull their money out of a country in a hurry, and that, if the country doesn't have enough reserves to buy up the excess local currency, massive currency devaluation. And this is something we've seen this happen. It has happened in the past in Mexico. It has happened in South Korea. It has happened, we can name so many countries where this has happened. Something like this almost happened in Greece, but instead of a massive currency devaluation, Greece was stuck on not a fixed exchange rate, but on its currency. Actually, it has adopted, instead of its own local currency, it has adopted another country's currency, or a common currency, the euro. And the euro reflects really what's happening in very competitive economies of Europe, like France and Germany. And poor little Greece isn't that competitive, and its exports aren't very good, and maybe its tourism business isn't doing that well. And so Greece, in 2012, had a massive crisis because investors began to pull money out of the country. There was a balance of payments crisis. Greece could not have a devaluation, which actually might have been a blessing in disguise. At least it would have been allowing it to export its products again, because it was stuck on the euro. So that's sort of an interesting variation on the problem of having a fixed exchange rate. But you can see when a country has high political risk, let's say the president gets assassinated, the leading presidential candidate that is going to keep the economy going strong, is campaigning. This actually happened in Mexico, and then he gets shot. Well, that in itself could cause a outflow of capital. That in itself could cause a balance of payments crisis. And we have seen this kind of thing happen. This happened in Mexico in 1994. So the contagion effect is another factor that's harder to predict, because this is what happens, that it's more of a psychological phenomenon. When investors might see a crisis happening in a neighboring country, and they might say, even if the country where they have their investments is quite stable, they might say, gee, if it happened in Indonesia, or if it happened in Malaysia, maybe it could happen in another Asian country. I'm taking all my money out of South Korea. Do you see? So that we call the contagion effect. It kind of spreads within the region. And so that in itself, if a country is more susceptible to this, if it has a lot of business with a neighboring country that has a crisis of its own, then there could be a very strong contagion effect. So these are all the factors, these together, and I'm calling it sort of in jest, the Nelson model. But really, I did bring together all of these factors, but these are factors that anyone would look at, anyone in the know, any smart Thunderbird-educated manager would be able to look at this and say, aha, the country where I'm doing business right now has all the indicators red. That country is ready to have a massive balance of payments crisis. That country is ready to have a possible currency devaluation. And I wish I had seen this coming in Brazil. It happened to me. But sure enough, it happened. And if I had known that, I might have been much better prepared than I was. But now that I have this framework, this is something that I personally recommend that all of you have. In fact, I urge you to laminate it, put it in plastic, and keep it in your pocket and consult it at any time when you're doing business in a country. And then you'll know whether that country is on the brink of a crisis or is quite safe and not anything to worry about. So that's it for the Nelson model. And now we'll go on into more depth on the some other factors.